All right, hello everybody. Thanks for joining us early today. We're going to get started in about 8 minutes. While you wait, connect your audio through that audio tab and check out handouts in the handouts pod. You can do those now, maybe come up with questions in advance for our instructors and locate that questions pod. That's where you submit questions during today's webinar. We'll get started in just a few minutes. All right, hello everybody. We can get started in 1 minute. Thanks for joining. A couple things before we jump into housekeeping. You can connect your audio. You can listen through the phone or computer audio. You can go to that audio tab and select whatever option is best for you. Also, while you wait, you can check out the handouts. Those are in the handouts pod. You can view those throughout the webinar and come up with any questions for our instructor in advance and locate that questions pod. That's where you submit questions. We'll get started in 1 more minute. All right, it's 12 o'clock on the dot. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Christy Sredny, Learning Senior Specialist here at Cherry Becker. A few housekeeping announcements before we turn it over to our instructor. Audio today will stream through the teleconference line or your computer speakers, and you can select whatever option is best for you under the audio tab. If you have any questions today during the webinar, you can put your questions in the questions pod. There, the instructor will see those questions and do their best to try to answer them during the webinar. If they can't get to them during the webinar, they will get to them at the end of the webinar or after the webinar is over. You can also check out handouts in the handouts pod. You can download them now and throughout the webinar and save them for later. To earn CPE, we'll have 4 polling questions. Those polling questions will appear during the webinar periodically, and you must answer all 4 to earn CPE. And at the end of the webinar, you will receive a course evaluation. Please complete that when you have time. We really appreciate your feedback. It helps us make these webinars better and better. And now, before I turn it over to our instructor, Bryce Gartner, just a little bit about him. He is a principal client experience for eSumo Analytics by Cherry Becker, a business intelligence division of the firm, helping organizations become data-driven through a combination of software tools and services, enabling data storytelling, visualization, and analysis. In addition to his corporate responsibilities, Bryce serves as an adjunct professor at Duke University's School of Business, where he teaches visual analytics for the MQM Business Analytics program. A natural entrepreneur, Bryce has held strategic leadership roles as CMO, CIO, and CTO in multiple industries and continues to merge marketing and technology to create strategies that drive innovative opportunities and growth. Bryce has spoken at the national, regional, and local level on topics including big data, data analytics, and visualization, technology, integration, change management, marketing, and operational strategy. In 2018, eSumo Analytics was named the top 20 data visualization providers in the nation by CIO Review. eSumo Analytics also received Partner of the Year awards for the Americans from Tableau Software in 2016 and 2018, and Building Clients for Life in 2019. And I will go ahead and turn it over to Bryce Gartner to get started.
Thank you, Chrissy. I appreciate everybody being here today, and we're going to talk a lot today about how we get started in building a successful analytics strategy. As my intro said, all of this really stems from my interest in analytics, coming from looking for a balance between my roles in both the technology side of businesses and really the go-to-market marketing side of businesses. And understanding how the interplay between those two could really be supported with the analytical functions within an organization. Over the last several years, I've been lucky enough to be an adjunct professor at Duke, and in that have been able to really investigate and dive deeper in how analytics can have a significant impact in exploring those opportunities with a lot of the students. Additionally, I think it's important to understand, I come at this from the perspective of somebody who's been at a lot of startups, looking for ways to help companies have an advantage and be able to have significant double-digit growth over a period of time. And to be able to do that is always a function of leveraging data and analytics, being able to take advantage of your position in the marketplace better than your competitors, or more agile than your competitors, by leveraging data and analysis. I've been lucky enough to have a lot of success in that role, and I attribute most of that to the fact that we in those organizations were really looking at data as a differentiator, understanding that if we did that better, we understood our customers better, and we understood the marketplace better with the use of data, we could be more successful. Ultimately, I want to start with what other people say. With what other people are saying and where the research is driving, McKinsey talks about how much more effective in all aspects of business, and especially around customers and profitability, people are when they're data-driven. Now, data-driven is one of those things that's a buzzword. What does data-driven mean? Well, data-driven means we're leveraging every component of data that we have as an organization, and we may also be looking for data that's outside of our organization to pull into our analysis. And we're going to talk more about that in just a little bit, and some specific customer examples of how that came together. Additionally, MicroStrategy, which is one of the software players in the industry, did a review of analytics in 2018. And what was interesting is one of the challenges that we see in analytics that we're going to talk about a solution for today is in building our strategy is how do we get data in the hands of everybody in our organization so they can make decisions? Because making decisions is at every level of the organization becomes critically important if we're going to be as efficient and effective as possible. We have teams of people who are oftentimes our most invested in asset of an organization, but to ultimately deliver for them, ultimately deliver effectively, they need the data in their hands. If they're working void of the data, they're not as effective as they can be. Additionally, we've got to understand that we've got to use all of the data that we have in our possession, and then we've also got to look for other sources to augment how that plays out. Thinking about all of those things, all of those elements in how we pull together data and where we grab data from and how we use it becomes important in our overall strategy. If we just think about pockets of data that we have, or elements of data, or data that we might want, but we don't go out and seek it, then we're limiting what we can do with our analytic strategy. So we need to always be taking into account what we can do. Gartner, no relation to me, the big group that does forecasting and industry evaluation in different spaces and consulting, they've really created what's called this analytics ascendancy model. And this talks about the different type of analytics. And so if we're going to talk about an analytic strategy, we really need to think about what are the different components of analytics and how we need to be thinking about those. Gartner puts it on a spectrum like this, where it talks about descriptive analytics. What happened? That's our reporting. That's some of our basic analysis. Why did it happen? Now we're digging a little bit deeper. We're doing the click through. We're doing the double click on the information and really trying to get deeper into what is happening within the analytics itself. We then move forward to the predictive analytics. Now, this is what we hear a lot about today. We're building models, we're using AI, we're introducing data scientists more into the mix, and we're identifying trends to where we can forecast and predict. Additionally, we add prescriptive analytics to that. Prescriptive analytics are where we add machine learning, and not only are we thinking about what's going to happen in forecasting and building models that give us forecasts, but now we're building learning models and simulations that allow us to also make recommendations based on what's happening, what we predict is going to happen, what other variables are in play, how we can be prescriptive. Now, as you can see in their analytics ascendancy, there's value increases and difficulty increases as you move along the spectrum. But one of the things I want to talk about as you look at this, this leads us to believe that we're all trying to get to prescriptive analytics. And I've kind of redone the analytics ascendancy. And, oops, sorry, we're not to a checkpoint yet. As we look at my version 2.0 of analytics ascendancy, yes, it's saying the same thing, but I think there's a very important differentiation. I don't look at, and we don't look at it as a process that we're all trying to get ultimately to prescriptive analytics. In our analytics strategy, we have got to continue to focus on descriptive and diagnostic and predictive and ultimately prescriptive with the data we collect. But we're not trying to get ourselves into a situation where everything we look at is prescriptive. There will always be a need for the other elements of analytics. We want to apply the more difficult and the higher value elements of analytics where they make sense. And that component of what we do is where this gets important. So now we're going to take a quick break for those of you getting CPE, and we're going to do our poll question. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to do our poll question.
And everyone, you can answer this polling question in the questions pod. You can put A, B, C, or D in the questions pod. So everyone, to earn CPE, you just put your answer to the question, A, B, C, or D, in the questions pod. That's how we will track your CPE by everyone just putting your answer in the questions pod instead of, normally we do use the polls, but the polls are not launching. So we're just going to put your answers, or you are going to put your answer in the questions pod, and we will track CPE that way.
All right, everybody's had a chance to answer. We're going to go ahead and move on. I always like to start with the things that we want to avoid, because learning where we don't want to go always helps lead us down the path of when we're talking about the way to get to a successful analytic strategy is some of the common mistakes that we need to avoid on the way. We find that there's 3 common mistakes. There's a denial strategy, which I'll talk about, a technology-centered strategy, and the instant ubiquity strategy. Each of these strategies, each of these mistakes are very common, and a lot of times when people are just setting out to build an analytic strategy and a data strategy, they run into these. So let's talk about mistake number 1, the denial strategy. The denial strategy is where we believe we already are doing everything we can possibly do on the reporting front. We believe we've already got all the reports. I have all of my Excel files that I pull together and that I use on a regular basis. And those give me all the information I will ever need. A lot of times we get caught in that and we don't think about other data points, or we don't think about areas from other functions in the organization because we are focused on that one element. So when we start to go down that path, we're denying that there might be other options. Or the main one that we see in the denial strategy is, I'm never going to be able to have access to that data internally, or even I'm not going to be able to get that data externally. And so as we look at the different mistakes, this is one of the key ones to avoid. Because as soon as we start to say, hey, I'm not going to be able to do it, or we don't have it, or I have everything I need, we're already putting up a roadblock to building that successful strategy. The second mistake, also a very common mistake, is that we think we need to start with the technology. Coming from a person who's been in the technology space for 25 plus years, this one is the hardest one to overcome. We always think it's going to be the latest shiny software object that's going to solve my data or analytical problems. Software and new tools and capabilities play a critical role in having a successful analytic strategy. But if we start there, or we just put the onus on our IT or technology department to solve it for us, then we're going to make a big error. Analytics, which we'll talk about more in a minute, is not about the technology platform. It's not about having someone else solve the problem for us in the technology department. When we have an organization that thinks that technology-centric is the way to start an analytic strategy, we always see that circle back to having to rebuild or redo some of the strategy. The last one is my favorite. This is where we try and take the whole elephant that is our organizational data, and we want to deliver analytics for everyone day one. This is that ubiquity concept, where if we're going to have an analytic strategy, it means everyone needs to answer their questions on day one of the delivery of the analytic strategy. And we're trying to take the whole elephant all at once. And that causes all kinds of different challenges. It causes challenges in identifying and actually prioritizing what happens. And it gets in the way of actually being able to implement a successful analytic strategy. So with these three elements in mind, these three mistakes, and many of you may have already started down this path at your organization and run into one of these mistakes or challenges, the good thing is understanding that is, as we start to look at the foundations of a really solid analytic strategy, you will be able to see very quickly how you can get that ship righted. So the attributes of a successful strategy really come in three components. There's foundational, there's execution, and then there's the deliver. Those three components of just the strategy part, not getting into the actual doing of the analysis, the delivery, the tools that you use, the people you have, but essentially understanding how you build a framework around this. The other thing that I want to do is talk about that in building a strategy and identifying that you want to build an analytics strategy is that you don't think that this is a long process. This process, depending on your organization, complexities, quite honestly, the political makeup of the organization, who needs to be involved, how they approach different aspects of problem solving, this may take a couple of days, a couple of weeks, or a month, but it isn't designed to be a long, drawn out process. And as we talk about the foundations, that'll make a lot more sense. So the first foundation is to stay completely away from technology. It's to think about questions. It's to think about the questions that your business will be better off knowing the answer to on a regular basis, and understanding that the answers to those questions lead to metrics. Those metrics should really be focused on what your company's vision is. How do we see our preferred future as an organization? And maybe it's in operations or sales or our go-to-market strategy or marketing or technology. And what do we want our preferred future to be, and how are we going to measure our progress towards that preferred future? Most of the time, organizations have already developed that through strategic objectives, plans, and goals, and then it becomes distilling some of those high-level plan, goals, objectives, vision, distilling that down into key areas that can help make decisions around that. That has to be baked into your analytics strategy. One of the key things is to keep your strategy around analytics at a level that's ultimately going to deliver on measuring against the business objectives, and understanding that business objectives happen at all levels of the organization. So the questions and metrics that are defined as you drill down through the organization become continually critically important. As an example, the questions and metrics that were defined by one of our examples today is an online auction company that focuses on selling agricultural and heavy construction equipment in an online no reserve auction. They were focused and were seeing a lot of success, but what they also saw was that they weren't as focused as they wanted to be. They were still getting into areas that didn't appear as profitable. They knew they wanted to grow, and their company vision was to be the leader in this space in North America. A big, broad vision. That was their preferred future. To do that, they started to identify, how are we going to measure what that looks like? And so they looked at it twofold. One, they looked at what information do we have? They knew all the bidding and buying and buyer and seller activity that they had on the site, so they could really drill down into that. They could also work to get the information and questions identified for individual regions, individual types of auctions and products. And they also identified that they were not the holder of all of that information today. They understood that part of their challenge was going to be getting their arms around data that gave them a feel for how much was actually happening in the market of moving these products around. So besides all of their internal data and wanting to make sure they had an analytic strategy that supported getting information to their sales teams, their sales managers, their regional people, their executives, they also wanted to bake into that strategy questions that they had to go find other data for. So a big part of their strategy became, we want to incorporate other external data sources that provide market data, that provide sales pricing data for different types of equipment, so they could see how they were comparing to other places in the marketplace. In doing so, they built a strategy that got that data, presented that data, and ultimately, with their data strategy and identifying these questions, metrics, and other sources of data, they have seen 15x growth in 5 years. They went from being a small regional player to a national powerhouse in 5 years by building a solid analytics strategy that didn't only answer the questions that they had the data for but weren't asking, but looked outside. Another key foundation to building an analytic strategy is identifying who the internal advocates are going to be and who the teams are that are going to help put together the strategy. Because to identify the questions and the metrics, you really have to have a strong understanding beyond your company vision and your strategic goals of what questions need to be asked. The most successful analytic strategies that we've seen executed on have some level of executive sponsorship, whether that's the CEO, the CFO, the COO, or the chief marketing officer. The analytics strategy has had an executive leader who is a big part of defining the strategy and then supporting it and pushing it through out the organization. The other key things here are looking at functional teams. So we start to understand in building the strategy, what are the key questions as we get deeper into different functions within the organization, whether it's sales, operations, others, and then cross-functional teams. Being able to understand where across the board we may have some similar questions, and we might have some data in marketing that the operations team didn't know existed. So making sure as part of the strategy that there's organized collaboration on helping define and prioritize some of the key questions and operational goals of the organization. An example of a group that did this very well is a marketing and media company. They're actually focused on helping other clients make media and marketing decisions. And in doing so, they're broken into a lot of different groups. Their operational group that is actually buying media time or making media placements. They are broken into 2 different groups of traditional media and digital media. And they were also tasked with organizing and getting data and supporting the decisions that they were making. Well, they did a fantastic job as their leadership identified key people. Their chief operating officer identified a need for analytics and helped them design an analytic strategy that not only grabbed the right people within the organization, but also identified external opportunities for them to share the data with clients to make sure that as part of the analytics strategy that they were monetizing some of their internal analytics on their performance externally, because it created value in their customers' minds in 2 areas. It created transparency and it created value that other competitors weren't offering. Additionally, they actually in their teams, functional, cross-functional, they identified key customers that could provide input into what kind of analysis, what components could be delivered externally. And that supported all of their efforts in defining their analytic strategy and how they were going to put that into play. So we're at another checkpoint. Again, we're going to use the polling system isn't functioning today, but we're going to use the questions again. So take a minute to answer the checkpoint poll question and go from there. All right, it looks as if everybody's getting their answers in. Another key foundation to a strong and building a strong analytic strategy is how we evaluate and iterate the strategy coming together. Number one, we have to set a cadence. Like I said before, sometimes building an analytic strategy happens in a number of days or weeks, and it's not a long, setting that cadence isn't a long process, but we need to define it up front. If we want to start with a framework for an analytic strategy, then let's define that we're going to try and solve this in a couple of days. If we believe that it's taking a couple of months, then let's define it up front and set a cadence for meeting. We also want to define our criteria. We want to define what we're trying to accomplish. So going back to the previous two, who's going to be involved? What are our strategic goals and objectives? And what are we going to put the strategy, what criteria are we going to put the strategy through to make sure we're successful? And then finally, we want to iterate. We don't want to just come together one time and say, this is all the answers. Analytic strategies that are successful are most successful when they go through at least a couple of iterations. And the reason that that is so important is because when we go through those iterations, what we're finding is that certain things, certain elements of our strategy are going to bubble up as being more important. And quite honestly, it gets really interesting when we're working with the cross-functional teams and we see what happens with the teams, that as we iterate, that a lot of times a function, maybe in operations, brings to light some key elements in that by being exposed to an iteration that drives home some more value for what marketing needs to have included in the analytics strategy. The other key to this is repeating. And in repeating what is happening, we always want to be able to evaluate where we are. So if we put together an analytics strategy and we start to put it to work, we want to run through this process again at some set period of time to make sure the things that we set out to do, one, are going where we want it to go or what needs to be tweaked. It's always, the strategy always is a living document, because as we've learned so vividly in the last 6 months, the world in which we created a strategy can change very, very quickly. The best example I can give of this is in a high-tech manufacturing group, they started down the path of building out their analytics strategy. And initially, they went down the path of one of the most common mistakes. Let's start with the technology. Let's plug in some technology and that will solve the problem. Ultimately, it got them a little ways down the analytics evolution path. But then what started happening is other parts of the organization started seeing what they were doing, which was a very positive experience. But what they found was that they hadn't really thought through all the needs of the organization. They hadn't looked at some of the other elements, and that some of the things that were getting time spent on them were not as high a priority. And so they had to reevaluate where they were, and they took a pause. They took that pause and they took their analytics strategy and sat down and built it. And they didn't make it all encompassing where they were trying to eat the elephant all at once, but they looked at where they were, what the foundations they had in place, and ultimately started to work their way back into some of the other key foundational elements to get where they needed to go. And then they started to evaluate and iterate on what they were building to just further expand the capabilities, the opportunities, and to continually build a cadence and a process for reevaluating the priorities based on what was happening and how the analytic strategy needed to morph based on different elements. And for them, it changed quite frequently because they were acquiring other companies, they were divesting different divisions, they were doing other elements that caused the analytic strategy and the vision of the organization to change, which meant that had to flow all the way through the analytic strategy. Time and again. Another key foundation, and this is where it gets a little more critical on the technology side, but it has to be talked about up front and it has to be included in your strategy. You have to think about stewardship of data and security. Because if you're going to have an analytics strategy, the use of that data creates responsibility for the data being maintained in a consistent way. And by using that data, by having a consistent analytic strategy, and by putting it together, you need to define in there so it is clear to everyone that there is a responsibility around data existing, that data being maintained in a consistent way, and ultimately that you can use security in a way to enable more people to have access to the data, which sounds antithetical. Most of the time we think about security as keeping people out. A big part of your data strategy has to be about how we're going to utilize security, maybe more effectively than we do today, to let people in. The other component of the stewardship is you will start to find, once it's defined in the data strategy and the outcome of the why the data needs to be maintained effectively becomes more obvious, because those people who may not have been as diligent about maintaining the data are going to now find that they're wanting to use the outcome of the analytics, and they're going to immediately see the importance. But defining it in your strategy and identifying it as a key component of success is very important for sharing with and keeping the team involved in understanding how to put this strategy together. Our sample here surrounds an international property management company and real estate company. They were challenged with lots of information, lots of data surrounding projects, surrounding properties, surrounding people, surrounding vacancies, all the different elements that you can imagine. Trying to keep their arms around FP&A, financial planning and analysis, around just project progress, around just the property management, elements of operational property management itself, dealing with competitive pressures in a new environment, all of those kind of things. What they found was they were doing pretty well on the stewardship side. They had a couple of areas, a couple of gaps where they needed to make sure their analytics strategy shared what the value of keeping that information up to date, especially around project management and budgets and things like that. But their biggest challenge was this diverse and distributed workforce of people who needed to access the information. And the key for them was leveraging security to not only provide more information, but limited to what was in people's purview, but being able to provide them more information, but leveraging technology and components of the technology to be able to limit the security to just what they needed to see, but be able to see it more frequently and be able to see it more automatically through the leveraging of some of the technology. And pretty much all of the different technologies can support this, some easier than others, but being able to identify the way to deliver that to the technology, through the technology, actually gave people more access to data than they previously had, because there wasn't a way to easily limit what they had access to. It was either an all on or all off. But identifying upfront in the strategy that they wanted to be able to empower a distributed workforce more efficiently by giving them more data was a key element of their strategy. Our third checkpoint is, which is not an element of evaluate and iterate? Go ahead and answer in the questions box once again. All right. Hopefully everybody was able to get that question answered. Seeing a lot of answers in the question box. Once we have all of these foundations in place, whether it's about defining the questions, whether it's about understanding the teams, pulling all of this together, really boils down to one thing. I found this quote as I was pulling this together, and I thought it was very appropriate for how you need to approach your analytic strategy. And the reason that this is so appropriate for how you need to approach your analytic strategy is everyone is trying to tackle this challenge. Everyone is trying to figure out how to put data better to work for all the reasons in those first couple of slides. All the data shows that people who are doing analytics, people who are using data, shows that they are more successful, more profitable, more effective. And if we think about this, a lot of times in our common mistakes, we are denying that we can do it, or we already have it. We're trying to do too much all at once. or we're looking at things through just a technology lens, which lets us put off doing other things. The key to execution in an analytics strategy is agility. We have to not only refine it and iterate, but mostly we have to keep shepherding it forward. We can't always be Amazon, who's using prescriptive analytics every time you log in. They're using predictive analytics to look at supply chain and other elements. We can't be that group if we think about the group that's flying. We can't necessarily be even a group that's running. But we have to do, it's incumbent on us as leaders in trying to move our organizations forward in analytics, is to always keep us moving forward. We have to be agile in being able to challenge what we're doing today, being able to enhance what we're doing today, or being able to quit doing something that we know is not, that's providing an impediment to us moving forward with our analytics strategy. Agility is achieved in execution of building your analytics strategy by being the voice that says, we need to talk about how we're going to measure this. We need to think about other elements of data that we might be able to obtain. An example is one of our clients that manages a venue that attracts thousands of attendees every day. They were being very successful, but they continued to be agile in their strategy in thinking about data that they could go get outside, and they started to identify in their analytic strategy that they needed to look at what impacted their most important expense category and their most important revenue category, which was traffic. If they had more traffic coming through, they needed more staff. If they had less traffic, they needed less staff. Well, they had all the metrics from what they had done historically, and they could do some decent predictive analysis from that, but they wanted to enhance their capabilities from descriptive and diagnostic and some basic predictive to really prescriptive. But to do that, they needed to be agile in how they thought about their world and their analytic strategy, and they very quickly, not through an analytics leader, and actually not through an executive, but through a functional leader who said, well, these are the kind of things that we believe impact our world, things like weather, things like other events going on in our city. And they leveraged and understood that looking at outside data and understanding the questions that they could answer with outside data could really have an impact on their two most important things: understanding the incoming foot traffic, the attendees, and understanding the staffing needed on a daily basis, 365 days a year. And in doing so, they incorporated the concept of always looking for ways to improve with data we don't have into their analytic strategy. And ultimately, when they implemented some predictive and prescriptive analytics, including weather, other events happening in their city, they started to refine an analytics process that really gave them some predictions of how many people they would have coming through the door every day, and ultimately how many staff they needed to have based on weather events. And they continue to look for other data points that can help refine how they approach that project, how they approach their biggest single expense component every day. But that goes back to their strategic vision, which is to deliver their experience to more people every day and to do it more efficiently. All back to a strategic goal and objective like we talked about in the foundations, but remaining agile, not saying, hey, we're just going to do the best with what we have. We're going to continue to look for new opportunity. Finally, and this is the one where the ball gets dropped a lot, but the final thing for building a successful analytic strategy is deliver. You have to be able to deliver this analytic strategy to your organization. A lot of times we go away, we get our cross-functional teams and our functional teams and our leadership who's all behind it, and we get this really great analytic strategy, even building the best of the foundations. But we forget to deliver. We forget to take that process. We forget to take the outcome of that process and turn it into a couple of key areas. One is competency. We can't automatically turn on an analytics strategy without helping educate, at least at a high level, the value of using analytics, the value of using data more effectively, and then helping educate if we select new tools to use in that process. The competency component is the one that gets missed the most. And why is the competency component so important? It is so important because in 10 years of providing analytic strategy assistance, execution of the analytic strategy itself, and delivery of analytics on all levels of the spectrum to organizations from the largest companies in the world to small $200,000 a year top line nonprofit companies with 4 staff, the thing that we have seen cause strategies to fail is ignoring the fact that we're asking people to change and change management. And people aren't comfortable with change if they aren't educated on the why and the how they leverage new capabilities that are going to come from a solid analytic strategy. Defining those proficiencies that are going to be needed and how they're going to be delivered to guarantee competency in the organization is very important. And it doesn't have to be an extensive education plan. It can be a communication plan and bits of education or bits of goals in people's annual performance goals. It can be a single line item there, but it needs to be incorporated into how you approach building your analytic strategy. And finally, communicating. The analytics strategy as a written down piece of paper that gets shared among top executives and shared amongst key functional leaders does not ingrain the purpose of the strategy within the organization. It has to be shared. It has to be purposefully communicated. Saying we have an analytic strategy, doing a big kickoff meeting and ending it there is not what drives success with an analytic strategy. A kickoff meeting works. Introducing it, sharing it at different touch points where you're sharing other organizational achievements. But the best way to share with the organization beyond those more formal events are to start to share people executing on it. Sharing the, hey, we found this other external piece of data we've incorporated into analysis and we're smarter because of it. Finding a way to build a community sharing mechanism drives a big part of a successful analytic strategy. And that communication plan, that component should be baked into and follow the same scrutiny that the rest of the strategy has. If we're communicating one way and it doesn't work, let's iterate and find a better way to communicate. It's always got to continue to evolve. The communication and competency components are critical parts of the analytic strategy as much as the questions. And the foundations are a part of it. Our final checkpoint poll question is, what is the key to execution? Everybody can answer in the questions window. I'll give you about 30 seconds to get that done. All right, so the key things that I want you to take away today are always going to be to focus on these main three areas. I want to make sure that you focus on building that strong foundation. If we think about all the elements of foundation being questions and teams and the security and the different elements of a strong foundation, then you're well on your way to understanding how you're going to be successful with an analytic strategy. The other thing I want you to remember is you need to right size that. If you're a smaller organization, you don't need to have as extensive of a discussion to start to build those foundations. Start to build your strategy and then do what we talked about, which is evaluate and iterate. Make changes. That's the agility part. As you start to put this together, make sure when you go to execute that you're thinking in an agile manner. When you want and build that into your plan, build that into the analytic strategy. How you're going to execute on the strategy needs to be part of it, and it needs to have an agility as the primary focus of what's happening, of how you're going to execute. And then educate. Even in the communication, it's very important to focus on educating in the delivery component. Because if we come with the approach of educating at the delivery, then our communication is going to be structured so change doesn't feel as hard, because we're going to help people become more competent in the strategy and how to use analytics and why we're going down the path we're going. And we're going to be communicating the same way, showing the value, showing the importance of our analytic strategy and how we're actually putting it to work. I want to thank everybody for their time attending the webinar today. I know those of you that were attending for CPE have answered the questions, and those will get reviewed in the questions tab. Anybody who wants to contact me after the webinar, my email address is here on the screen. If you have any questions, we have a couple of minutes if you want to put those in the very full questions box. I can try and answer one or two questions before we wrap up the webinar today. All right, I'm not seeing any questions. I hope everybody has a terrific rest of your day, and thank you for attending our webinar today. And best of luck with your analytics strategy.